Imagine stepping into a world where the land is harsh, unpredictable, and filled with dangers you couldn't even dream of. The American frontier, a place often glorified in films and stories as the land of opportunity, freedom, and adventure, was actually much darker. Behind the cowboy legends and tales of fortune, there were filthy truths about survival on the frontier that are often left out. This wasn't just a fight against wild animals or nature. It was a fight for your health, your life, and your sanity. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the dirty, grim, and uncomfortable reality of life on the American frontier. Get ready for the gritty truths that many would prefer to forget. The American frontier has long been one of the most iconic periods in history, from the gold rushes to the cowboy shootouts. The idea of life on the frontier has been romanticized in ways that make us think it was an exciting, adventurous time filled with bold individuals making their own luck. But when you peel back the layers of these tall tales, what you find beneath is something much darker. Life wasn't full of gold and fame. It was filled with disease, death, filth, and hardship. People who lived on the frontier faced challenges that we could never even begin to imagine. It wasn't just the heat of the sun, the freezing winters, or the long, tiring days of physical labor. They faced something much more insidious, a world without modern medicine, basic sanitation, or even any form of comfort. The reality of living on the frontier was often terrifying, and it was downright filthy in ways that many settlers didn't expect. In this video, we're going to reveal the shocking, often disgusting realities of life on the frontier. From poor hygiene to deadly diseases and constant danger, the truth about frontier life is far messier than you might think. So sit tight, and let's take an in-depth look at the filthy secrets that people on the frontier had to endure just to survive. Unsanitary living conditions. First, let's talk about hygiene, or rather, the shocking lack of it. It's difficult to imagine how unsanitary life was, especially when we consider that even today, we take many modern conveniences for granted. On the frontier, there were no indoor bathrooms, no showers, and no plumbing. Settlers lived in crude cabins built out of logs, often with dirt floors. Imagine stepping into a cabin after working all day in the sun, covered in dirt and sweat. But without running water, there was no way to clean up. Bathing was an occasional luxury. Many people, especially those living in rural areas, would go without a bath for weeks at a time, and sometimes even months. The concept of personal cleanliness was not a priority. It was about survival, not comfort. When a bath was taken, it was often in a nearby river or stream, which was just as likely to be contaminated with bacteria and waste. If there was no water source nearby, settlers could go for months without ever bathing. When it came to relieving themselves, people used outhouses, simple wooden structures built over pits. These pits would often fill up, and there was no proper waste disposal system. Sometimes, the waste would spill out or seep into the ground. This unsanitary practice created a breeding ground for diseases that were deadly and contagious. The spread of disease. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to the rapid spread of disease. While we know now that bacteria and viruses are the cause of many illnesses, settlers on the frontier had no such understanding. Diseases like cholera, smallpox, dysentery, and malaria could easily spread through unsanitary conditions. One of the most terrifying things about life on the frontier was that many of these diseases spread quickly. Once someone in a community became infected, it wouldn't be long before it affected others. And with little access to medical care, people were often left helpless. The few doctors who ventured into the frontier had limited supplies and little knowledge of modern medicine. For many settlers, a disease outbreak often meant death. Without vaccines or antibiotics, a small sickness could turn into a deadly epidemic. Entire towns were wiped out by illnesses that could have been prevented today. Smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases. Settlers had no immunity to it, and it could be spread easily by contact. Anyone who came down with smallpox faced a painful, often fatal illness. The disease could kill within days, and survivors were often left with scars and disabilities. Outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, and other diseases would routinely devastate populations on the frontier, and many families would lose entire generations to these terrible illnesses. Constant dirt, dust, and mud. Now let's talk about the dirt, the endless, inescapable dirt. The American frontier was often a vast, unforgiving wilderness. In the absence of paved roads, the land was full of thick dust and mud. Traveling across the open land, whether on horseback or in a wagon, meant being covered in grime by the end of the day. Living in these conditions meant that dirt was inescapable. Even in the middle of winter, when snow blanketed the land, the dirt still found its way into homes. Many cabins had to be cleaned out regularly, but it was an uphill battle. The lack of modern cleaning tools meant that settlers used whatever they had, rags, brooms made from twigs, and bare hands, to clean the inside of their homes. This constant exposure to dirt and dust could lead to respiratory problems, and the poor ventilation of many cabins made it difficult to get rid of the grime. Clothes weren't much better. Without laundromats or washing machines, settlers had to clean their clothes in streams or rivers, and even then, they didn't always have the luxury of washing them regularly. The constant exposure to dirt and sweat meant clothes often became stained, torn, and uncomfortable to wear. For families that had limited clothing, it wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about survival. Clothes often doubled as blankets and were worn until they were too ragged to use. Contaminated water and food. Water was another issue. Water sources were often polluted with waste, animal carcasses, and other contaminants. In places where settlers didn't have access to clean, safe water, they had to rely on rivers, lakes, or streams, many of which were sources of waterborne diseases. Drinking untreated water led to diseases like dysentery and cholera, which would cause violent diarrhea, dehydration, and often death. Even the food supply wasn't immune to contamination. In the absence of refrigeration or proper food storage, food could spoil quickly. Meat was often salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it, but these methods didn't always prevent bacteria from growing. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant settlers often suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Food contamination wasn't just about spoiled food. It also meant that settlers lived with a constant threat of foodborne illness. In many cases, settlers had to make do with whatever they could find. If they didn't have enough food, they had to hunt or forage for whatever they could get. This often meant living on unclean, improperly prepared food, which could lead to further health problems. Wild animals and vermin. Wild animals were another filthy part of frontier life. While many settlers sought to tame the land and hunt for food, they were constantly surrounded by wild animals, many of which were dangerous. Wolves, bears, and even mountain lions would often threaten settlers' livestock and homes. But the real issue wasn't just dangerous predators. It was the pests. Rats, mice, and insects were a constant nuisance. Rats, in particular, were a serious problem. They carried fleas, which spread the deadly plague. The presence of rats in homes and storage areas was so widespread that entire towns struggled to keep them under control. These rodents would eat food supplies, contaminate bedding, and spread diseases like the bubonic plague. While settlers could fight off large predators, there was very little they could do to keep rats and fleas at bay. Mental strain and isolation. Life on the frontier wasn't just physically exhausting. It was mentally draining. Many settlers arrived in small, isolated communities far away from their families and loved ones. For months at a time, they could go without seeing anyone but the people they lived with. The isolation was hard on everyone, but especially on women and children, who often stayed behind while men went hunting or exploring. The loneliness and isolation led to serious mental health problems. Depression was common, especially in areas where the terrain was particularly harsh, and the weather could turn quickly. The fear of violence, disease, and death weighed heavily on the settlers' minds. Many individuals suffered from mental exhaustion, and some even took their own lives. Life on the frontier was not just a battle for survival in the physical sense. It was also a battle for mental stability, violence, and lawlessness. The lack of law enforcement on the frontier led to a sense of lawlessness that made the dangers even worse. Settlers had to defend themselves from thieves, outlaws, and even other settlers. Violence was an everyday reality, whether it came from disputes over land, cattle, or personal matters. There was no real police force, and few places where justice could be served. Because of the lawlessness, many frontier towns had to rely on vigilante justice. This often meant that personal grudges were settled with violence, and innocent people could suffer, whether it was a bar brawl or a feud between neighbors. The frontier was a place where tempers flared and fights broke out with little to no repercussions. The struggles of women. Women on the frontier faced challenges that were even more daunting than those faced by men. While men were tasked with building homes, hunting, and defending the land, women were responsible for everything else: caring for the children, cooking, cleaning, and managing the household. The labor was constant, and there was little relief. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Without modern medicine or trained midwives, many women died during childbirth or from complications afterward. Women didn't have access to the pain relief or medical care we take for granted today. They often delivered babies alone or with only the help of other women in the community. The constant threat of illness, combined with the demands of raising children and running a household, made life on the frontier even more grueling for women. Daily struggles with nature and the elements. Life on the frontier was inextricably linked to the forces of nature. Whether it was blistering heat, freezing cold, heavy rains, or relentless snowstorms, settlers were forced to deal with whatever the elements threw their way. The unpredictable nature of the weather made it difficult to plan or live in comfort. In the summer, the intense heat could cause crops to dry up, animals to suffer, and people to become dehydrated. Settlers would often have to find makeshift ways of staying cool, whether by dipping in nearby rivers or making their own crude shade structures out of trees and branches. The heat also increased the likelihood of wildfires, which were a constant threat to homesteads. In the winter, temperatures could plummet to life-threatening lows. With no modern heating systems, settlers had to rely on wood-burning stoves to stay warm, which was often insufficient during extreme cold spells. A single night without proper warmth could mean frostbite or even death. When the snowstorms came, travel was all but impossible. Many families would be stuck in their homes for days or even weeks, with little food or firewood to sustain them. Caring for livestock during these extreme conditions was another added challenge. In the winter, farmers had to worry about animals freezing to death, while in the summer, they struggled to provide enough water and feed to sustain their herds. With limited resources, settlers were constantly battling the elements, not just for comfort, but for their very survival. The reality of interactions with Native Americans. One of the most complex and difficult aspects of life on the American frontier was the relationship between settlers and Native American tribes. In many cases, settlers viewed the Native Americans as obstacles to their dreams of land and expansion. Conflict arose over territory, resources, and cultural differences, and while there were moments of peaceful interaction, violence and bloodshed often characterized these encounters. For many Native Americans, the arrival of settlers meant the destruction of their way of life. Their lands were taken, their resources depleted, and their cultural practices threatened by the encroachment of settlers. Tensions boiled over into conflicts such as the Indian Wars, where settlers and Native Americans clashed in violent skirmishes over land and sovereignty. But the frontier experience for Native Americans wasn't just about warfare. Many tribes were devastated by diseases brought by European settlers, diseases like smallpox and influenza, for which they had no immunity. These illnesses wiped out entire communities, further disrupting the balance of their lives. Settlers often saw the native population as inferior, and many justified their violent treatment of indigenous people with racist and colonialist attitudes. For Native American tribes who had once lived in relative peace and harmony with the land, the arrival of settlers brought not only direct violence, but also a social and cultural upheaval. Entire tribes were displaced, their homes destroyed, and their way of life altered forever. The struggle of Native Americans on the frontier is an essential chapter in the history of westward expansion, yet it is often glossed over in popular narratives that focus on the settlers' experiences alone. Alcohol, gambling, and vice. In the absence of entertainment and proper outlets for leisure, many settlers turned to alcohol, gambling, and other vices as a way to escape the harshness of their daily lives. Saloons and drinking establishments were common in frontier towns, and these places served as social hubs for settlers. It was here that people came to drink, gamble, and blow off steam after long, exhausting days of work. Alcohol was widely consumed, and its effects were often destructive. Heavy drinking led to violence, broken families, and health problems. For many settlers, alcohol was not just a way to relax. It was a coping mechanism to deal with the trauma, isolation, and fear that came with life on the frontier. It was common for people to become addicted to alcohol, and saloons were often filled with rowdy, intoxicated individuals, especially in frontier towns with few regulations. Gambling was another popular pastime. The absence of structured entertainment meant that people would turn to games of chance as a way to pass the time. Card games like poker, as well as dice games, were regularly played in saloons, with large sums of money often changing hands. Gambling, like alcohol, was a way for settlers to escape their grim realities, but also led to ruin for many. People who lost their money in gambling often found themselves in difficult situations, with little to no way of recovering what they lost. While these vices were common, they also created social problems and increased the already high levels of violence in frontier towns. Fights over gambling debts, alcohol-induced brawls, and arguments over women were all too common, and lawlessness often turned towns into chaotic and dangerous places. Law and order, or the lack of it. As we've already touched upon, life on the frontier was characterized by a lack of law enforcement. In many places, there were no police officers, no courts, and no formal justice system to ensure that laws were followed. In fact, in some of the earliest frontier towns, there was no real government at all. Settlers were left to defend themselves against not only Native American tribes and wild animals, but also other settlers who might have had conflicting interests. This lack of law and order created an environment where violence could erupt at any time. Frontier towns were often places of chaos and danger, where disputes were settled through physical altercations, and survival depended on having a quick temper and a fast hand with a gun. It wasn't uncommon for conflicts to escalate into gunfights, and in places like Tombstone and Dodge City, the number of violent deaths was staggering. Vigilante justice was common. If a settler felt that they had been wronged and couldn't find a legal remedy, they might take the law into their own hands. A sense of lawlessness prevailed, and for those who live on a frontier, it meant living with constant uncertainty. As the frontier expanded and settlements grew, towns would begin to appoint sheriffs or marshals, but these positions were often filled by men who weren't necessarily skilled in law enforcement and were sometimes just as corrupt as the criminals they sought to catch. The moral dilemmas and cultural tensions. The frontier was a place where moral and cultural tensions were often laid bare. The pressures of survival often meant that settlers had to make difficult choices that challenged their sense of right and wrong. In many cases, settlers were forced to compromise their ethics in order to survive. For example, Native American tribes were often pushed off their ancestral lands by settlers looking to expand, leading to violence and conflict. Many settlers justified their actions by claiming that they were fulfilling their manifest destiny, or the belief that it was their right to expand westward. This ideology led to numerous atrocities, and the moral implications of these actions continue to be debated today. Similarly, the practice of slavery was prevalent in some frontier territories, especially in the South, where enslaved African Americans were forced to work on plantations. This created a moral dilemma for settlers and society as a whole. While some settlers rejected slavery, others believed that it was an essential part of their economy and society. These moral conflicts, compounded by the difficult realities of frontier life, added an emotional and psychological weight to the lives of those who lived there. The American frontier, a period often glorified in stories of rugged independence, freedom, and fortune, was in truth a harsh and unforgiving place. Behind the myth of cowboys and outlaws was the grim reality of daily survival, a life full of dirt, disease, isolation, and constant struggle. While the frontier brought with it the promise of opportunity and new beginnings, it also demanded an immense physical and emotional toll from those who ventured into its vast unknowns. If there's one thing we've learned from uncovering the filthy secrets of life on the frontier, it's that survival was not just about conquering the land. It was about fighting against nature, illness, violence, and even the psychological burden of isolation. The settlers who made their homes on the frontier endured hardships we can scarcely imagine today, with little to no support systems or safety nets. Every day was a battle, and for many, that battle ended tragically, whether through disease, violence, or the unforgiving elements of nature. It's easy to look back on the frontier and imagine it as a time of glory, when brave men and women carved out new lives in a wild, untamed land. But in truth, for many, it was more about survival than success. People didn't always succeed. They lost everything. They lost their homes, their families, their lives, sometimes even their hope. And yet, they kept going, driven by a sense of necessity that could not be ignored. Imagine what it must have been like to wake up each day, knowing that you had to face the unpredictable weather, the constant threat of disease, and the struggles of maintaining your livelihood. Every single task, from gathering firewood to securing food to protecting your family from predators, was a monumental challenge. It wasn't about comfort, about thriving in a new land. It was about staying alive. But the realities of the frontier were not just about hardships. They were also about the resilience and determination of the people who lived there. While the frontier was often a brutal place, it also gave rise to incredible stories of endurance and survival. It's easy to forget that behind every cowboy, every settler, there were families and individuals working day in and day out to make a life for themselves. Their strength, courage, and grit were often their only tools for survival. It was in their perseverance that the true spirit of the frontier existed. Not in the victories of the few who struck gold, but in the uncelebrated labor of the many who simply survived. The lives of women on the frontier, too, are often overlooked in traditional histories. While the men might have ventured out to seek fortune, the women were often the backbone of the family unit, holding together homes, caring for children, and performing the majority of the labor. And yet, many of these women never received the recognition they deserved. Their struggles were just as significant, raising children in the face of disease, working tirelessly to maintain their homes, and dealing with the emotional and physical toll of frontier life. For Native Americans, the frontier was a land of loss. Their relationship with settlers was fraught with tension, violence, and heartbreak. As settlers expanded westward, Native American tribes found themselves pushed off their land, their cultures threatened, and their lives disrupted in ways that are still felt today. The tragic history of Native American displacement is a dark chapter in the story of the frontier, one that is too often overshadowed by the heroic tales of settlers and explorers. It's important to remember that while settlers sought new opportunities, they did so at the expense of indigenous populations, whose lives and cultures were forever altered by the arrival of outsiders. In considering the frontier's history, it's also crucial to understand that much of the violence, lawlessness, and moral ambiguity of the time was driven by a combination of factors: fear, survival, and sometimes greed. The lack of law enforcement, coupled with the psychological strain of frontier life, often turned ordinary people into vigilantes, and conflicts quickly escalated into violence. This wasn't just a land of heroes and villains. It was a land where choices were shaped by desperation, survival instincts, and moral compromise. Settlers had to decide not just how to make a living, but how to live with themselves in a world where right and wrong were often difficult to distinguish. Alcohol and gambling became crutches for many settlers, a way to cope with the psychological toll of the frontier. These vices were not just distractions. They were lifelines for people who were struggling with trauma, isolation, and the constant threat of death. While we often remember the frontier for its hard men and gunfights, we should also remember it as a place where people, often driven to the edge, turned to substances and games of chance to escape the overwhelming pressures of their daily lives. The frontier may have been wild, but it wasn't just a battleground of men against nature. It was a battleground of men and women against their own fears, their own limitations, and the often unforgiving forces of history. The dirty secrets of life on the frontier weren't just about filth and disease. They were about the harsh truths of survival in a place where every day was uncertain. And yet, in the face of all these challenges, the frontier shaped the future of the United States in ways that still echo today. The lessons of resilience, self-reliance, and perseverance that were learned on the frontier have become ingrained in American culture. The stories of hardship and survival are not just about the past. They speak to human capacity to endure and adapt in the face of adversity. In the end, the American frontier was more than just a story of cowboys and pioneers. It was a place where human beings tested the limits of their endurance. It was a place where hope and despair coexisted side by side, where survival meant confronting unimaginable difficulties, and where the spirit of determination burned brighter than the landscape's often unforgiving beauty. For those who lived it, the frontier was a dirty, dangerous, and often filthy place, but it was also one that demanded resilience, strength, and a willingness to keep going no matter what. So, the next time you hear about the Wild West, remember, behind the myths and legends, the truth is far more complex and far more human. The pioneers, cowboys, and settlers who carve out lives on the American frontier face some of the toughest conditions imaginable, and it's that struggle, that fight to survive, that truly defines the frontier experience. If you found this deeper look into the filthy secrets of life on the American frontier enlightening, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for sticking with us through this untold history. And remember, sometimes the truth behind the legends is far more captivating than the stories themselves.